A federal judge walked into his daughter's school cafeteria on a Tuesday afternoon and saw something that stopped him cold. His 8-year-old daughter was standing in the lunch line with a tray in her hands while 3 children nearby pointed at her braids and said things no child should have to hear. An adult was standing 6 feet away. She looked up. She saw it. She looked back down at her clipboard and wrote something. That was the moment Marcus Bennett understood that the school he had fought to get his daughter into, the school with the trophy cases and the glossy diversity brochures and the waiting list 3 years long, had been failing her every single day. What he did next would cost him more than he expected and change more than he planned. Before we continue, comment what time you are watching and where in the world you are from, and do not forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you simply cannot miss. Marcus Bennett had spent 22 years on the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. He had presided over cartel cases and civil rights actions, and had written opinions later cited by the Supreme Court. Washington legal circles knew him as a man of measured authority, not the loud kind. The kind that comes from actually believing the law exists to protect people who cannot protect themselves. The federal courthouse near the National Mall was his second home. He knew every corridor of it. He had given the best years of his professional life to what it represented. His real home was a Georgetown row house where he had lived 14 years with his wife Diana, who laughed loudly the subway and argued hard, and wanted a child with a constancy that turned years of disappointment into something she carried with a particular stubborn grace. She had started the adoption paperwork herself. She filled out forms, chose agencies, talked about it every Sunday morning over coffee, with the unhurried confidence of someone who has already decided a thing will happen. And then on a Thursday afternoon in October, she collapsed in a hospital parking garage. A brain aneurysm, gone before the ambulance arrived. Marcus was in a hearing when the hospital called, and the world changed the way it changes in those moments, completely and without the possibility of reversal. He was 50 years old, and he had just lost the person who made him understand why everything he did mattered. He came very close to letting the adoption die with her. For 3 months, he sat in the Georgetown house after work and ate food he did not taste, and read case files he could not absorb. Then one evening he found her desk drawer, the folder with the agency forms and the notes in her handwriting, and a page where she had listed possible names. He sat with it for a long time. He understood that finishing what Diana had started was the most important thing left for him to do. 8 months after she died, Marcus brought Naya home. She was 6 years old, 2 years in the foster system, and she stood in the doorway of the Georgetown house, holding a backpack with a stuffed rabbit inside, and looked at the framed photograph of Diana on the hallway wall. "Is that your wife?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus said. "She is very beautiful," Nia said. He crouched to her level. "She would have loved to meet you." Nia looked at the photograph one more moment. "I think she still can," she said, with the perfect certainty of a child who has not yet learned to doubt the things that matter most. They had been a family of two ever since. He learned to braid her hair from phone tutorials, sitting on the bathroom floor, while she sat on a step stool, giving patient and frequently contradictory instructions. He learned the conditioner she needed, the exact way she liked her ribbons tied, the mysterious broccoli exception to her general refusal of green foods. She had Diana's habit of arranging things smallest to largest. She had his stubborn refusal to leave a problem unsolved. She was the best thing in his life. And for 3 months he missed the fact that something was very wrong. This is the part Marcus had trouble forgiving himself for. He was a federal judge. His entire professional life was organized around the project of seeing clearly, refusing to be misled by surface presentations, finding the truth inside the structure designed to conceal it. He had spent 22 years doing it for strangers, and his own daughter had been carrying something heavy enough to change the shape of her mornings, and he had looked at the surface and called it fine. He had believed in Ridgemont Academy. That was part of it. He had worked hard to get Naya enrolled, had been genuinely proud of it, had told himself that a school with that reputation, in that neighborhood, with those stated values, was exactly what she deserved. He had trusted the institution the way men who have benefited from institutions tend to trust them, with the comfortable assumption that a system that has worked for people like him will work for everyone he loves. He noticed things. The lunchbox coming home untouched. The way her hands twisted in her lap as they got closer to school. The triple checking of the backpack the night before, but he explained them. New school adjustment, introvert temperament. Diana's same quiet way. He explained them because explaining them was easier than what the alternative explanation would require him to do. The night he heard her prayer was the night the explaining stopped working. He had been passing her door, which was partly open, and she was saying her nightly prayers in the specific quiet way she always did. And he heard her say, in a voice so low he had to stop breathing to catch it, "Lord, please help me be strong enough tomorrow. Please help me remember, I am not what they say I am." He stood in that hallway for a long time after she fell asleep. The next morning he made breakfast and watched her move through the kitchen with the careful, deliberate precision of someone getting ready to endure something. And he asked how she was doing, and she said, "Fine, Dad." And he drove her to school and watched her walk through those oak doors with her spike and her braids swinging. And then he sat in the parking lot and made a decision. He came back at lunch, no suit, khakis and a navy sweater, visitor badge. He found a spot near the cafeteria entrance behind a column and he waited. What he saw in the next 20 minutes reorganized everything he thought he understood about what Nia had been living inside. She appeared in the lunch line and almost immediately a boy in a Cardinals cap said, loudly enough to be heard but quietly enough to avoid adult attention, "Mophead finally showed up." Two girls laughed. A third looked away, which was its own kind of agreement. Nia did not respond. She moved one step forward in line. "What do you think is in her box today?" the boy continued, addressing the air in the practiced way of someone who has learned that direct address invites accountability. "Probably that nasty stuff again." And the lunch aide, Patricia Colton, who was standing 6 feet from this exchange, looked up, scanned the scene, looked at Nia, and wrote something on her clipboard. Just wrote something. Marcus felt something settle in him that was colder and quieter than anger, the specific cold of recognition, not of an incident, of a system. Nia moved through the line economy of someone who has learned that the fastest path through a difficult space disturbs as little air as possible. She found a corner table and ate alone, her movements small and contained, her eyes on her tray. He stayed 20 minutes and left before the bell. That evening, Nia talked. She sat at the kitchen table after dinner with her homework, and Marcus sat beside her and said simply, "Tell me about school." She held her pencil still. Then she told him, in her careful, measured way, one word at a time. She told him about the comments that had been going on since the second week of school, 3 months now. About her braids being a daily subject. About the lunch she stopped eating in the cafeteria because eating it meant enduring remarks from kids who had been handed permission to remark. She told him about a boy named Brian who had poured chocolate milk on her chair directly in front of Patricia Colton, and Colton had said, "Accidents happen," and handed her a paper towel. She told him that a teacher named Darlene Ruiz had tried to file a complaint on her behalf, and it came back marked reviewed and addressed with nothing changed. She told him about Vice Principal Donald Hargrove, calling her into his office early in the year and telling her, with all the confident helplessness of someone who believes himself to be helping, that the best way to make friends is to find common ground. As though the children mocking her braids and her food and the color of her skin needed only a better conversational opening. She said all of this without outrage. Just facts. Facts that had been facts long enough that the injury had worn smooth. "I want it to stop," she said, pushing a piece of chicken with her fork. "But I want it to stop for Tyler and Amara too. It is the same for them." Marcus covered her hand with his. "None of this is your fault. I know," she said quietly. Then, a few seconds later, "But knowing does not make it easier to walk in the door." "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Are you going to do something?" "Yes," Marcus said. "What I should have done a while ago." The next morning he submitted a formal educational records request under his rights as her legal guardian. What happened next was not what he expected. The school responded with polite and practiced delay. He received a partial set of records, incident summaries with key sections redacted, and a note from Linda Ashworth, the principal, explaining that certain staff communications were protected under privacy guidelines. Marcus filed a more specific request. Under partial response, he retained a private attorney to send a formal demand letter citing FERPA and state education code. The school's legal counsel called to clarify the scope of the request. What had looked from the outside like a matter of reviewing records was from the inside a bureaucratic structure extremely good at producing the appearance of transparency while delivering as little actual information as possible. It took 4 weeks and 2 written escalations before anything close to a full record picture began to emerge. What broke it open was Darlene Ruiz. She had been a third-grade teacher at Ridgemont for 5 years and had been trying to escalate concerns about Cole's conduct and Hargrove's complaint handling for 18 months. She had been told twice directly by Hargrove himself to stay in her lane and let administration handle disciplinary matters. When Marcus's letter to the school board and superintendent became public, she sent him an email. It was unsigned, 3 sentences. She said she had documentation he needed. She said it had been sitting in her personal files for 14 months because she had not known who to give it to. She said she would meet him if he could guarantee her identity would not be disclosed before she chose to disclose it herself. They met at a coffee shop in Tacoma Park, 2 neighborhoods and a district line away from Ridgemont. Ruiz was a woman in her mid-30s who had the exhausted precious someone who has been keeping careful records of something for a very long time against the possibility that someday the records would matter. She brought a folder. Inside it were complaint forms she had submitted that came back rejected with notations she had not written. Internal email threads in which Hargrove told 2 teachers that certain families have a pattern of interpreting normal school dynamics as discriminatory incidents. A routing log she had managed to photograph from a shared drive before her access was restricted, showing that complaints from white students traveled a different administrative path than complaints from Black and Latino students. Not faster. A different path entirely. One that ended in documented disciplinary action. The other that ended in Hargrove's desk and a notation. Social dynamics monitored, no escalation warranted. I kept submitting things, Ruiz told him. She was not dramatic about it, just tired. Every time I did, it came back. Finally, someone told me, off the record, that if I kept pushing, I would be managing a very difficult performance review. So I stopped submitting and started keeping copies. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks building a case the way he built every complex case, from the evidence out, without conclusions drawn before the facts were organized. He worked with the records Ruiz had provided, the partial records the school had released, affidavits from 3 other parents who had filed and been dismissed, and a statistical analysis he constructed himself from the data available. The pattern was not subtle. 47 documented incidents involving a minority student over 4 academic years. 41 closed without formal friction. 6 incidents involving white students. 5 a rigorous disciplinary review. He wrote a letter, 5 pages, addressed to the district superintendent, the D.C. Board of Education, the Regional Office for Civil Rights, and Principal Ashworth. His PR liaison Sandra Mills at 7 in the morning and called him at 7:15. Judge, she said, you understand that this is going to be on the news by noon. Yes, he said. Are you telling me not to send it? A pause. No, she said. I am telling you to send it, and then call me, because we are going to have a very busy few days. He sent it at 7:30. By noon, it was on 3 local outlets, and his courthouse clerk had 14 media requests in the queue. The school board called an emergency session. Principal Ashworth sent a careful email requesting a private meeting. Hargrove issued a statement through the district communications office that contained in the phrases deeply committed to student well-being and thorough internal review, and communicated absolutely nothing. Marcus declined the private meeting. He had watched enough private meetings produce nothing except the impression of progress. He requested a public forum instead, sent a venue reservation for the school auditorium before Ashworth could respond, and copied the superintendent, the board, the PTA, and every family on his list who had filed a complaint that had been closed without action. In the weeks before the forum, Marcus did something he had never done in 22 years of judicial life. He went to people's homes, he sat at kitchen tables, he stood in church parking lots, in the November cold and listened. Angela Morrison was a hospital administrator whose son had been told his natural hair was a distraction in class. She had filed a complaint, attended a private meeting with Hargrove, been assured of resolution. The only change was that her son now asked to stay home on presentation days. When she described this, she stopped twice and had to collect herself, not because she was fragile, but because she had been describing it to administrators for 2 years and being nodded at and thanked for her concern and sent home. And this was the first time she was describing it to someone who was writing it down with a pen and not moving on. Gregory Davis was an attorney whose daughter had reported a racial slur. She had been listed as the provoking party in her own complaint. Gregory had not raised his voice or cried when he told Marcus. He had set his coffee cup on the table with a precise controlled movement and said, "My daughter's complaint was investigated, and the conclusion was that she had provoked the incident. She was 8 years old. She was called a racial slur. She was the one investigated." He paused. "I need you to understand that I have been living with that specific fact for 16 months and have not been able to make anyone in that building look me in the eye and explain it." He asked Darlene Ruiz if she would speak at the forum. She said she had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. The night of the forum, Ridgemont's auditorium filled beyond capacity. Families stood along the back walls. A local TV crew set up near the emergency exit. Superintendent Carol Jeffries sat at the main table on stage with 3 school board members, including Robert Haynes, who had spoken to Marcus by phone 3 times in the previous 2 weeks and had said, on the last call, "I want you to know I have been watching this district for 4 years, and I have been waiting for someone to put together what you put together." Principal Ashworth sat beside Jeffries, carefully composed. Donald Hargrove was at the far end of the stage in a charcoal suit. His expression was managed in the specific way of someone who was prepared for this meeting and intended to navigate it the way he had navigated everything for 20 years through careful language and practiced concern and the institutional weight of his position. He had underestimated the room. Patricia Colton was in the third row of the audience alone. Marcus sat in the front row with Nia. She wore her favorite deep burgundy dress and her copper clips in her braids, and she held her cardinal notebook in her lap. Angela Morrison's went first. She stood and she named incidents, dates, and Hargrove by name. And her voice was steady the entire time except once. Very briefly, when she said, "My son asked me last week if there was something wrong with the way he looked. He is 9 years old. He asked me that." The room shifted. Gregory Davis came next and described what had happened to his daughter with the controlled specific precision of a lawyer who knows exactly what damage a well-organized sentence can do. A man in the back of the room called out, "That's right," when Gregory described the complaint routing, and someone shushed him, but 3 other people turned and nodded. Then Beverly Thompson, whose daughter had been the only girl in her class not invited to a birthday party, who had tried to raise this with staff and been told it was outside school jurisdiction. "I know it was a birthday party," Beverly said, her voice rising slightly. "I know how that sounds. But it was the 3rd time this year my daughter came home and asked me why no one wanted to be her friend. And every time I went to that school, I was told it was social dynamics. Social dynamics. Like my child is a variable in an equation and not a person." Then Darlene Ruiz, who described 18 months of submitting reports that came back altered and being told to stop pushing. Her voice broke once when she looked at Nia in the front row and said, "I saw what was happening to you. I need you to know some of us were trying, and it was not enough, and I am sorry it was not enough." And then Patricia Colton stood up. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unscripted is happening. She walked to the microphone slowly, gripping her folded paper. She was not composed the way she had been at her station with her clipboard. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally gotten to the place where she had to put it down. She looked at the front row. She found Naya. She started and stopped. "I," she said. Then nothing for a moment. "I want to say something." Her voice was thin. "I was there every day, in that cafeteria, and she stopped again, pressed her lips together, kept going. I told myself it was kids being kids. And then I stopped seeing it. I stopped looking." She shook her head. She was not eloquent. This was not a speech. This was a woman dismantling something she had been standing on. "I kept telling myself it was not my place. And after a while I guess I stopped seeing how wrong that was." She looked at Nia again. "I am so sorry. You deserved someone to stand up. I did not do that, and I am sorry." She folded her paper and returned to her seat without looking at anyone. The room was completely still. Nia watched Colton walk back and then looked down at her notebook. Marcus could not entirely read her expression. He watched Hargrove. The vice principal was watching Colton sit down. His practiced composure had developed a quality Marcus recognized from the bench, the specific stillness of a person whose story is no longer holding together but has not yet found the next version. Hargrove leaned toward the microphone. The board members around him tensed. "I want to address the statistical claims in Judge Bennett's report," Hargrove said. His voice was controlled. The complaint routing process at Ridgemont follows district-approved protocols. Every case was reviewed according to established guidelines. If there are concerns about individual outcomes, we welcome a formal review through the appropriate channels. Angela Morrison's hand shot up from the audience. She did not wait to be recognized. "With respect, Mr. Hargrove, I had 5 conversations with you about my son over 14 months. In every one of them, you told me the situation had been addressed. Can you tell me specifically what was done?" Hargrove paused. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand your concerns, and I want to assure you that those conversations were part of our ongoing commitment to student welfare." "That is not an answer," Gregory Davis said, from 3 seats down, not loudly, just precisely. "I submitted a formal complaint. I have the submission date. I have my copies. Can you tell me what happened to it after it reached your desk?" Hargrove opened his mouth, closed it. Jeffries was watching him from the center of the stage table. Ruiz, from the audience, said quietly, "I have email records of what happened to it." The room moved, not loudly, just a shift. The way air shifts in a courtroom when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Hargrove sat back slightly. He looked at his hands on the table. When he looked up, something in his expression was different. The management had stopped. What was underneath it was harder to read, older. "I need to be honest about something," he said. His voice was different now, lower, less polished. "I processed those complaints in a way that I believed was appropriate at the time." He paused. "Sitting here tonight, looking at what has been documented, looking at the people in this room, I know that is not sufficient. I know that what I am responsible for is the outcome and not only the intent." Jeffrey spoke then, clearly and immediately. "The district is announcing tonight that Mr. Hargrove has been placed on administrative leave pending a full independent investigation. A review panel with external oversight will be convened within 30 days. She looked at the room. "I want every family in this building to understand that what has been presented tonight represents a systemic failure at this school, and I take full responsibility as superintendent for not catching it sooner. The investigation will be thorough, and the results will be made public." Hargrove did not object. He sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at the middle distance and said nothing else for the rest of the evening. 3 weeks later, a Friday afternoon, Marcus received an email from Hargrove's personal address, not the district account. 2 paragraphs. The first said he had submitted his resignation, effective immediately, and that he believed it was the appropriate consequence for what he had allowed to happen under his administration. The second paragraph was shorter. It said, "I have spent 20 years believing that maintaining the institution was the same as serving the children in it. I understand now that those are not the same thing. I am sorry it took this long to understand." Marcus read it twice. He printed it and put it in his desk drawer. Not in the leather folder, somewhere more practical. The investigation took 4 months, not weeks. The school board approved emergency funding for a cultural competency training program in January, but the full rollout took the rest of the school year. The new complaint protocols were designed and piloted in the spring semester and became permanent policy the following fall. The independent review panel's final report, published in March, formally substantiated the pattern of differential treatment Marcus had identified and resulted in formal disciplinary actions against 2 additional staff members. Patricia Colton remained on staff. She had requested to stay and had been required to complete a 6-month restorative justice program and monthly oversight reviews. She did not miss a single session. She did not complain about any requirement. She sent Marcus a letter in February, 3 pages. He read it twice and placed it in the leather folder beside Diana's photograph and Nia's drawing of the 3 of them. The new principal, Dr. Renee Okafor, arrived in January and spent her first week eating lunch in the cafeteria with the students. Not as a performance, actually eating, asking names, watching the room, with the attention of someone who understands that what happens at lunch tables every day is the actual culture of a school, more true than anything in its annual report. By spring semester, the complaint routing system had been redesigned. By the following fall, the Parent Oversight Committee was operational, and Angela Morrison was on it. One Friday afternoon in April, 5 months after the forum, Marcus sat in the back of the Ridgemont cafeteria. Nia came through the doors with two girls. Emma, who had red curls and argued about science fair hypotheses with the intensity of a future researcher, and Jordan, whose quick humor had become one of the reliable daily pleasures of Nia's school life. They sat at a center table, and Nia unpacked her lunch with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has stopped expecting it to be used against her. The food Marcus had made that morning came out of the container, and Emma leaned forward immediately and said, "Okay, that smells amazing." "What is?" Nia said. "Sit down. I will explain everything," with such authority that Jordan started laughing before the explanation even began. Patricia Colton passed their table on her rounds. She paused. She looked at Nia for a moment. A simple look, nothing performed. She kept moving. Marcus watched his daughter eat every bite of her lunch. He watched her laugh and argue and plan. When the bell rang, she looked up and found him across the cafeteria and waved. A full, easy wave, entirely herself. He waved back. She disappeared into the current of children, moving toward their next class, copper clips in her braids catching the April light. He sat for another moment at the table near the windows. The table in the corner where she had eaten alone for months was occupied now by a group of second graders, deep in some argument involving a trading card. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Exactly as it should be. There is a thing about this story worth saying plainly, without the surrounding prose. Marcus Bennett had spent 22 years believing that institutions, good ones, built by people with good intentions and maintained by professionals who believed in what they were doing, would function the way they were designed to function. He had benefited from this belief. It had not been unreasonable, but his daughter had taught him, at a cost she had borne alone for 3 months while he was explaining the signs away, that institutions protect themselves, not maliciously, not usually with any deliberate intent to harm. They protect themselves the way water seeks the path of least resistance, maintaining what is comfortable for the people inside them. The children in that cafeteria did not need malice to keep doing what they were doing. They needed only for the adults around them to keep writing things on clipboards. Donald Hargrove had not designed a discriminatory system. He had inherited a structure and chosen, daily, to maintain it because the maintenance required less of him than the examination would have. Patricia Colton not set out to fail Nia. She had stood in that cafeteria every day and told herself a story about what she was seeing that cost her less than the story that would have required her to act. Those choices compounded. They produced, over time, a child who prayed every night not for friends or good grades, but for the strength to survive a Tuesday. They produced a father who had trusted an institution more than he had trusted the evidence accumulating in his own kitchen every morning. The lesson is not complicated. Silence is never neutral. Every adult who saw what was happening and looked back at a clipboard chose a side. The choice had a cost, and the cost was paid by children, the way these costs always are, by the people with the least power to refuse them. What Naya had asked of Marcus was not complicated either. She had not asked him to dismantle a school district, or use his judicial authority, or spend his social capital, or any of the things he had reached for first. She had asked him to see. She had spent 3 months waiting for him to stop explaining and see. That was what the letter and the records requests and the kitchen table meetings and the forum had been. Not a performance of power. A father doing what seeing required of him. Nothing more and nothing less. The night before the forum, Nia had been drawing in her cardinal notebook at the kitchen table while Marcus reviewed his notes. After a while she set down her pencil and looked at him. "Dad," she said, "are you scared?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because I am going to say true things in front of people who do not want to hear them, and I do not know exactly what happens after that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My teacher read us about Daniel in the lion's den." She said, "The brave part was not that the lions did not hurt him. The brave part was that he walked in." Marcus looked at his daughter, 8 years old, telling a 52-year-old federal judge something about courage. "That is exactly right," he said. She picked up her pencil. "So, walk in, Dad," she said, with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who has said the important thing and sees no reason to say it again. The morning after the forum, he made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice. Nia came downstairs in her uniform and sat at the counter and said, while reaching for her fork, "I slept the whole night." He looked at her. "The whole night?" "Usually I wake up around 3, she said, the way she said things she had been keeping to herself. "And then I cannot go back to sleep because I am thinking about school." He absorbed this, another thing he had missed. "Last night I slept the whole night," she said, and started eating. They ate together with the radio on low. She talked about Emma's science fair theory, and whether direct sunlight actually made beans grow faster, or whether everyone just assumed it did. He listened and answered and refilled his coffee, and watched his daughter eat every bite of her breakfast with the appetite of a child who is not dreading what comes next. At the school drop-off, she hopped out with her backpack, said "Bye, Dad," in the offhand tone of someone with places to be, and walked through those oak doors without looking back. He sat in the drop-off line for a moment before pulling forward. He said something quietly in the car that was not quite a prayer, and not quite a promise, and was addressed in the specific way certain things are addressed to Diana. He said, "She is okay. We are going to be okay." Then he drove back through the Georgetown streets to the courthouse, where 3 briefs were waiting on his desk, and he sat behind his bench, and he did the work that was his to do, the work of a man who had learned, from an 8-year-old girl with copper clips in her braids, that the important thing a person with power can do with that power is use it to make someone else's truth impossible to ignore. There is something worth dwelling on about the 3 months Marcus missed. It was not that he was absent. He was there every morning making breakfast. He drove Nia to school himself most days. He was home for dinner. He read to her at bedtime. By any reasonable measure, he was a present and attentive father. The missing was something more specific than absence. It was the particular blindness of a man who had trusted an institution and had therefore built a frame around what he was seeing that kept the difficult explanation out. When the lunchbox came home uneaten the first time, he asked if she had not liked what he packed, and she said it was fine, and he accepted that. When she started leaving 15 minutes of food on her dinner plate, where she used to clean everything, he told himself growing children had variable appetites. When she started taking longer to get ready in the mornings, moving through her uniform routine with a deliberate slowness that he now understood was the slowness of someone who did not want to arrive at the destination. He called it perfectionism. She was precise. She was quiet. She was, he told himself, adjusting. Ridgemont was a large school, and she had arrived in 3rd grade when social groups were already formed. These things took time. He had believed all of this comfortably. He had believed it because Ridgemont had a diversity statement on its website and a trophy case full of academic achievement awards, and because institutions with those things he had understood care of the children aptly were supposed to take care of inside them. The night of the prayer in the hallway did not only disturb him because of what Nia had said. It disturbed him because he understood, standing in that hallway in the dark, that she had been saying some version of this prayer for a long time, and he had not heard it. She had not been hiding it from him. The door was partly open. She was simply praying at a volume appropriate to a private conversation with God, not calibrated for an audience, because she did not expect anyone to be listening. And the question of why she had not told him was one he sat with for several days after his first cafeteria visit. He thought he understood it. Nia had come to the Georgetown house carrying the particular wariness of a child who has been moved through enough placements to know that stability is conditional and that adults love you. So when the situation becomes complicated enough, decide that a different arrangement would be better for everyone. She was careful with Marcus. Not performatively careful, not visibly anxious about his approval, but careful in a deeper way, in the way of someone who has decided that the maintenance of something valuable requires attention to the comfort of the person you most need to keep. She had absorbed his pride in Ridgemont and his investment in what it represented for their life together, and she had decided at 8 years old that adding her suffering to the picture would be a cost she would carry rather than hand to him. That understanding arrived in Marcus like a physical thing. He was a man who had spent 22 years providing justice for other people, and he had somehow raised a daughter who did not believe she could ask him for it. That was the thing he could not make smaller or more comfortable, no matter how long he sat with it. He stopped making it comfortable. He let it be what it was, and then he went to work. The records battle was the first indication of how thoroughly Ridgemont was prepared to manage accountability from the outside. When Marcus submitted his initial request under FERPA and state educational records law, the school produced a partial set of documents in 4 business days and a cover letter from Principal Ashworth, noting that certain records involving staff communications and administrative deliberations were exempt from disclosure under district policy. He was a federal judge. He understood exactly what that language meant and exactly what it was designed to accomplish. He submitted a more specific request. Another partial response. He retained an education attorney, a woman named Sandra Keller who had spent 15 years doing exactly this kind of work, and who called him 3 days after. He retained her and said, "They are doing the standard playbook. Produce what is clearly disclosable, claim privilege on everything useful, wait for it to give up. Most parents give up at this point." "I am not most parents," Marcus said. "I know," she said. "That is why I took the case." The process of extracting full documentation took 4 weeks, 2 formal escalations through Keller, one threat of a federal civil rights complaint, and one source that Keller had not anticipated, and that changed the calculation entirely. Darlene Ruiz's email arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 sentences, unsigned, from a personal address Marcus did not recognize. She said she had documentation he needed. She said it had been sitting in her personal files for 14 months. She said she would meet if he could protect her identity until she chose to go public herself. They met at a coffee shop well outside the Chevy Chase neighborhood. Ruiz arrived 8 minutes early and had positioned herself with her back to the wall and a view of the door. She was a woman in her mid-30s, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been keeping careful records against the possibility that they would eventually matter. She slid a manila folder across the table. Inside, it was a routing log she had photographed from a shared administrative drive before her access was quietly revoked. Complaint forms she had submitted with notations added that she had not written. An email thread in which Hargrove told 2 teachers that certain families have a pattern of interpreting normal school dynamics as discriminatory incidents, and asking staff to exercise professional judgment before escalating student complaints. 3 parent complaints in that email thread. All 3 were families of color. Marcus read through the folder without saying anything. When he reached the last page, he set it down. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 14 months, Ruiz said. "Why did you wait?" She looked at her coffee cup. "The first time I submitted a complaint and had it come back altered, I went to a colleague. She told me, off the record, that the last teacher who had pushed back on Hargrove's handling of something spent the following year on a performance improvement plan, for reasons that did not hold up but were difficult to challenge. I have a daughter in college. I have a mortgage." She paused. "I am not proud of that calculation, but it was the calculation I made." Marcus nodded. He did not judge her for it. He had seen enough people make that calculation in enough circumstances to understand that it was not cowardice, so much as the rational response to a system specifically designed to make the right choice costly. "Will you testify at a public forum?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I have been waiting to be asked by someone who was actually going to do something with the answer." The forum itself was 94 minutes long, and Marcus had prepared for most of it, and been surprised by the parts he did not. He had prepared for Ashworth's careful language, and Hargrove's institutional composure, and the specific way that boards and administrators manage public accountability proceedings, which is through the display of concern rather than its exercise. He had prepared for the parents who would speak haltingly at first, and then more clearly as the room proved capable of holding what they said. What he had not entirely prepared for was the cumulative weight of the room. 94 minutes of specific true things, said in the building where the false things had been maintained, by people who had been maintaining their silence at personal cost for months and years. That weight had a pressure to it that no institutional management strategy was built to absorb. When Hargrove had opened by defending the complaint routing protocols, Angela Morrison's question had not been loud or aggressive. She had simply asked him, very specifically, what had been done in response to her 5 conversations with him over 14 months. He had responded with language about ongoing commitment to student welfare, and Angela had said, calmly, "That is not an answer to my question." Gregory Davis had followed with the same precision. Ruiz had named the specific email thread. The room had shifted in the way rooms shift when multiple pieces of a picture arrive at the same time. Hargrove's composure had not broken. That is too dramatic a word for what happened. What happened was that it stopped working. The thing it was designed to project, the image of an administrator in confident control of a situation, could not survive contact with this specific room. What replaced it was something Marcus recognized from the bench. The stillness of a person who has run out of versions of their story. His statement about responsibility and intent had been shorter than Marcus expected, and more honest than he had anticipated. It was not a confession. It was a man whose frame had collapsed around him, acknowledging, in the presence of the people it had cost, that the frame had been a frame. Jeffries had moved immediately and decisively. Administrative leave pending investigation. External review panel. Results made public. She had not waited for discussion. She had been waiting for the moment when the institutional weight was behind action rather than against it, and she had recognized the moment when it arrived. Hargrove did not object. He sat with his hands on the table, and his managed composure gone, and said nothing else for the remainder of the evening. 3 weeks after the forum, a brief email arrived from Hargrove's personal address. Marcus read it twice. He thought about what it represented. A man at the end of a 20-year institutional career, sitting at a desk, somewhere writing 2 paragraphs and deciding to say yes. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not absolution or transformation, or any of the satisfying narrative resolutions that stories about institutional failure tend to reach for. It was a man who had done harm through the daily selection of comfort over responsibility. Sitting with that fact long enough to put it in writing and sending it to the father of a child who deserved better than what his choices had produced. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. The investigation ran 4 months. 4 months of careful documentation and panel hearings and policy review. Not weeks. The cultural competency training was approved in January and rolled out over the rest of the school year. The new complaint protocols were piloted in spring and became permanent the following fall. The Parent Oversight Committee was operational by September. These timelines were frustrating and bureaucratic and reflected the institutional pace of change that anyone who has ever tried to change an institution from the outside will recognize immediately. They also reflected something real, that the change, when it happened, was structural rather than decorative. Not a new poster in the hallway. A different system processing a different set of assumptions. The children who came through Ridgemont the following year would encounter a different school than Nia had encountered. Not a perfect one. Not one immune to the human tendency to choose comfort over accountability, but one that had been forced, by a specific set of people, refusing to accept the standard available explanations, to reckon with the gap between what it said it was and what it had been doing. There was a second day Marcus went back to the cafeteria before the records investigation had fully opened up, and this one he had not planned. He was driving back from a meeting at the Board of Education offices on a Thursday, and something made him turn south instead of north toward the courthouse. He told himself he needed more direct observation documentation. He knew that was not the whole reason. He signed in at the visitor desk and found his column and waited. When Nia appeared in the lunch line, something was different about her from the previous week. She had composed herself. She was always composed, but the residue of something was visible in the flatness of her expression, in the way she moved through the line, without lifting her eyes at all. He watched. 3 girls positioned themselves near the condiment station, in a configuration that was clearly deliberate. The one in the middle watched Nia come through the line and then said to the others, not quietly, "I do not know why they keep letting just anyone into this school." The other 2 laughed. The middle girl looked at Nia's back and said, "Louder, my mom says you are only here because they had to let you in. That is what my mom says. Nia stopped walking. Spus felt every muscle in his body tighten. He watched her back go completely still, and then she turned around. She looked at the girl with a steadiness that made the girl step back slightly, an involuntary small retreat. Nia said nothing for a moment, and then, quietly and clearly, she said, "Your mother is wrong." She turned back around and kept walking to a table. The girl made an outraged sound and said something Marcus could not entirely hear, something that included the word sensitive. And a second girl added something about always making everything about race. And Patricia Colton, standing at her station, looked up. She looked at the group. She looked at Nia's back. She looked back down and wrote something on her clipboard. She wrote something. In that moment, Marcus understood the full architecture of what had been constructed in this cafeteria. It was not built on cruelty alone. Cruelty required a structure. It required the daily maintained permission of adults who understood the rules well enough to document the presence of oversight, without the inconvenience of its exercise. The clipboard was not negligence in the simple sense of the word. It was the instrument. He sat in his car for a long time after the bell rang. That afternoon when Nia came home, she was quieter than usual. He made dinner and let her lead the conversation in whatever direction she wanted it to go. She talked about a book she was reading. She asked about whether bees actually communicated with dances, or whether that was something people said. He told her it was actually true, and she said, genuinely surprised, "That is extremely weird." He watched her eat most of her dinner with the specific grateful attention of a parent who has spent time watching his child not eat and understands the value of the opposite. After dinner, she sat at the kitchen table with her homework, and he sat nearby working on his notes from the records review. After a while, she looked up from her math work. "Dad," she said, "yeah, can I ask you something?" "Always." She considered this for a moment, choosing her words the way she chose her words carefully. "Do you think people can change? Like if they did something bad for a long time, can they actually change?" He set down his pen. "What made you think about that?" She shrugged, looking back at her worksheet. "Just thinking." He thought about Patricia Colton with her clipboard. He thought about Hargrove's routing desk. He thought about all the daily choices that produced a system. "Yes," he said, "I think people can change. I think it is harder than most people expect it to be, and it takes longer, and it requires the person to actually want to change rather than just want to stop getting in trouble. But yes, it can happen." Nia nodded, processing this the way she processed things. "Okay," she said, and went back to her math. He went back to his notes. Later he realized she had been asking about something specific, not about Colton or Hargrove, whose existence she was not yet aware of in any administrative sense, but about the children, the ones who had been doing the mocking. She was wondering, at 8 years old, whether the people who had been hurting her were capable of being different. He thought about what she had said the following week when he told her about the forum. He had explained it carefully, what it was, who would be there, what he hoped it would accomplish. She had listened with her full attention, her pencil set down. When he finished, she asked, "Will those kids be there?" "The ones from school," he said. "This is for parents and teachers and the school's board." "Oh," she said. "Then, do you think they know what they were doing was wrong?" He looked at her. "Some of them probably do. Some of them probably do not yet. I think some of them do," she said, "and they just do not care. But I think some of them genuinely did not know. Because nobody ever told them it mattered." He sat back in his chair and looked at his daughter for a long moment. This child who had prayed every night for the strength to endure a school day was now, in her kitchen, doing the work of extending to her tormentors the complexity they had never extended to her. He did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing he could add to what she had just said. "Come here," he said, finally. She climbed off her stool and came to him, and let him hold her the way she occasionally, cautiously, allowed. He said into her braids, "You are a much better person than this situation required you to be." She was quiet for a second, then muffled against his shoulder. "Dad, that is kind of a weird thing to say." He laughed. She laughed too, a small surprised laugh, and pulled back and looked at him with the expression she had when she thought he was being odd, but also when she wanted him to know she was okay. "Come on," he said. "Let us finish the homework, and then I will make popcorn. Can we put the cheddar powder on it?" "I do not understand why you love that," he said, getting up and moving toward the kitchen. "It is the best thing," she said, firmly, climbing back onto her stool. "It is objectively the best thing." He made popcorn. He put the cheddar powder on. They watched a nature documentary about birds that had both of them arguing about whether the bird of paradise's mating dance was impressive or ridiculous, with Nia firmly in the impressive camp, and Marcus maintaining that it was both. It was one of the better evenings they had had in months. He did not know if she knew that. He hoped someday she would understand that those evenings, those simple ordinary evenings when nobody was managing anything, and they were just two people in a house talking about birds, were the measure of what they had built together. Not the forum, not the letter, those evenings. One last thing about Nia: it is easy in a story like this one to let the child become a symbol, to let her represent something larger than herself. The injustice of the situation, the resilience of children, the moral clarity that adults sometimes lack. Stories about children who suffer tend to do this. It makes the suffering mean something. It makes the child easier to hold at the distance that symbols require. Nia Bennett was not a symbol. She was a girl who liked her braids done with copper clips and ate broccoli, but no other green foods, and got intensely invested in nature documentaries and had a particular laugh, surprised and genuine, that her father had been hearing more often as the months went on. She was a girl who had learned to pray for the strength to endure things she should not have had to endure, and who had done so with a quiet perseverance that deserved nothing less than the full force of every adult resource available to address what had caused it. She was also simply a kid. A kid who wanted to eat her lunch with her friends and not have to think about it. A kid who wanted to walk into school in the morning without squaring her shoulders against it. A kid who wanted the completely ordinary things that every child in that building was entitled to, and that some children in that building were having to fight for, and some children in that building were walking past every day without noticing. What she got, eventually, was most of that. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough that on a Friday in April, she could walk into a cafeteria and sit in the middle of the room and eat her lunch and laugh and argue about science fair hypotheses and wave at her father across the room, with the ease of a child who expects nothing more complicated from the afternoon than what arrives. That was the measure of what had changed. Not policy documents or the investigation report or the resignation email, or any of the institutional machinery that had been set in motion in the months since November. Those things mattered. They were necessary. But the measure was a girl in April eating lunch. The measure was always going to be that.
Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. We're preparing for you.